Today in the Last Wire podcast, we'll be talking with Victor Echo 6 Lima Kilo and the role amateur radio played in helping reconnect the community of High River. Welcome to the show, Vince.
Hey, thanks very much. Good afternoon, good evening.
Vince, can you share with us how you got involved with amateur radio? What sparked your interest? Where did it all begin for you?
I am an executive member of the Foothills Amateur Radio Society in southern Alberta. And when I was 7, my dad's cousin, VE3 Alpha November Delta, instilled a love of ham radio in me that took a little while for me to get around and do something with, but here we are.
It's not lost on me that the community we're talking about today, High River, is named after flooding events that have happened for thousands of years probably. But what made this event significant and what role did amateur radio play? Can you take us back to that event and tell us a little bit about what's going on in High River and how you got involved?
In 2013, when the water started coming up, this was no surprise to the residents of High River who've been through many high water events before, as the name of the town might suggest. The role that amateur radio played in all of that is we were their first line of communication to their town's employees, to emergency services, to the outside world, quite literally, and to provincial government. As all of their conventional infrastructure had failed. It was a very dire time for them indeed.
Can you walk us through the events that led to this catastrophic failure in the community? What happened? Where did they go wrong?
The weather changed very suddenly, so we have to go back to that for just a minute. For 48 hours ahead of time, we had very unseasonably warm weather in June, and there was still a pretty heavy snowpack in the mountains. And we had rains that made some of us wonder if we should be building boats or not that came down in that time frame. And the effect of that was that all of this snow in the mountains was getting rained upon, and many, many years of detritus and fallen branches and leaves and what have you up in the mountains that was gathering in these little ephemerals, these little small valleys where water wouldn't normally flow, all of a sudden started flowing, and this great big torrent and rush of water came down with this big mass of lumber and everything else that a flood might carry along with it. And it came down at such a ferocious pace because it almost broke loose in the mountains that it caught many, many people unaware. The water came up in downtown High River in a matter of 12 minutes from the point at which it overran the bank. The TELUS infrastructure, so that's our provincial landline provider out here, one of them, formerly Alberta Government Telephone, AGT as we'd know it. It's located about 100 meters away from the normal banks of the Highwood River. And much of the switching infrastructure in that one-story above ground building is below ground level. And so as the water came up very unexpectedly and very quickly, it quickly surrounded that building and seeped its way into the basement and rendered all the landline telephones not usable. In accordance with this, most of the then infrastructure for TELUS Mobility Cellular was also taken out because that switching station at the time was the hub for not only TELUS Landline and TELUS Mobility, but connectivity via sat phone to the outside world.
Can you walk us through the events that led to your activation and your involvement in the High River flooding?
At 10:30 in the morning, I placed a call to a High River town into the EOC, and I reminded them we were available to serve if needed, and the message came back that everything was good. At 10:50 a.m., they evacuated the hall because the water overran the banks. We received a call at 1:30 in the afternoon through the Edmonton Provincial Operations Center from the Alberta Emergency Management Agency saying, "We have lost contact with High River, please deploy." And so that began my quest to get into the town of High River, which took 3 hours, and it's a 20-minute trip from my home normally. So 3 hours to leave my job in the city, get home, grab my gear, and get out the door again. Maybe an hour on a good day took 3 times as long because of all of the road closures. Of course, I met with RCMP checkpoints at the highway, wondering why I want to go into an area that's under mandatory evacuation, and with a few quick radio calls on their system up to Edmonton, I was granted access and able to bring my gear in and get set up. It was very much flying by the seat of our pants, as the first 24 hours in any disaster tends to be.
That moment when they lost communications with the disaster site High River, I'm sure there was an element of panic and chaos as they try to figure out what to do and how do they establish communications. And the person that suggested, let's call the ham operators, I'm sure that would be an interesting moment to capture. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall.
The orders that I got were to get deployed and get a crew. And when I arrived, I was told to look for a certain individual who was a staff member of the AEMA. And I walked in and I identified him by his uniform. And I said, I'm your ham radio operator. And I'm here because Edmonton can't get a hold of you right now. And he looked at me and he said, well, you're here for the EOC commander. And I said, no, sir, I am definitely here for you. They need to hear from you right away because they've not been able to reach you for several hours. And he looked a little sheepish when he saw the sat phone sitting on the table. It became a point of training later on to say sat phones don't sit on tables in the middle of rooms. They sit in, at least in the windowsill, where they have half a chance to catch the satellite. There was, I'm sure, quite a moment of concern by his coworkers in Edmonton that he couldn't be reached. The AEMA rep had been on site already for 24 hours because they had anticipated with this kind of a rain load, moisture load, that they would be having problems. Nobody in their wildest dreams, of course, imagined it would be like this. There have been floods in High River before. I was there in 2005 with floods, and I was again a month later in downtown Calgary, and there was, by contrast, a little bit of water. There was so much water coming over in 2013 through the town of High River. It was more than the flow of Niagara Falls during spring runoff. And if any of you have stood on the shores of Niagara Falls or at the shore of Niagara Falls, as I have, you're fascinated with this 8-foot tall wall of water going over the top of the rocks and down below.
You've now arrived in High River. What did you bring? What was in your go kit? And what did you set up first?
2-meter FM analog is what we used. We quickly triaged what we had to work with. We were in the backup EOC center because primary EOC was flooded out, town hall. I was in a facility I'd never set foot in before. Typical drop ceilings with metal T-bar roof. Make for great ground planes for mag mounts when you stick them upside down on the ceiling. And we found some power, and we found ourselves a little corner of the room with a whiteboard, and we began to set up our gear. We were on the air within minutes of landing at the site, and we had established communications on provincial amateur backbone all the way back up through to Edmonton.
Now, for a situation like this where the community has been evacuated, what type of messages were you transferring to the ECO? What were you trying to? What was the communication backbone like?
The EOC's responsibility and any government's responsibility is to ensure that the town is getting the support, or the impacted area, I should say, is getting the support that it needs. The traffic that we were handling was at 2 or 3 different levels. We had mission 1 was to surround the town and give them a net of communications. Mission 2 was to ensure the hospital in the middle of the flood zone could retain its communication back to Alberta Health Services. And mission 3, of course, was to ensure that the provincial capital in Edmonton still understood what the situation was. So we were running 3 or 4 different frequencies and concurrent nets to pass that traffic. In the case of the town traffic, it was a matter of logistics. Do we have ample food and supplies for the evacuation centers that were set up rather hastily? In the case of the provincial traffic, it was every 4 hours, let's make sure that the situation report is getting through. Can we put a cell phone in the hands of the emergency commander to make sure that his message is getting out? I said earlier that TELUS cell phones had failed, and very few people at that time were on Rogers cell phones, and they stayed up and running because of independent infrastructure. So we made sure that EC was aware that Edmonton was looking for information from them, and that they could hold their meetings and get the information required. In 2013, I didn't have a Go kit. I'm embarrassed to say that. I do now, and it's chock full of all those things that I've learned over the years that I need in terms of a radio Go kit. The biggest single lesson that we learned is the ICS methodology teaches us that we take our resources and we stage them in a certain location. We take our construction tractors that we might need to clear a roadway of debris, and we put them in a parking lot outside of the affected area, and we deploy them as needed. And radio amateurs don't have a spot that we stand. Our place to stand is on a frequency, and that's our staging area. And so we stage on that frequency, and we get ready to deploy into whatever our assignment is at that time. The single best thing that we did during all of this was we made sure that net control for the local traffic surrounding the High River area was not at the EOC. There were 55 people crammed into a room that was meant for 20 because it was a backup facility. The noise, the lack of air conditioning, all of these things meant it was frankly a pretty miserable place to be. And we off-sited our net control complete with their own independent crew on independent power some 20 kilometers away. They had line of sight simplex to us if they needed it. And that was the single most brilliant thing that we did was effectively, if you will, we outsourced net control away from the EOC and took the concern of managing resources and assignments, and we gave it off to a separate team entirely, a team of 7 that kept the 55 of us going. I had been on site at High River for under 2 hours when the floodwaters kept coming up, and we evacuated the secondary EOC, and we drove an hour because of road closures down to a neighboring town that had a mutual aid agreement, and we set up in their fire hall. Many of the plans we were making in the first 12 hours were absolutely off the cuff, just working with what we knew we had to work with and developing plans on the fly. I remember working with my partner, Scott, VA6 Oscar Charlie, and I'm giving him direction as I'm trying to turn left in heavy traffic to follow the RCMP to get to a place that I didn't know we were going. Here I am trying to turn left, and I'm like, Scott, you got to set up a net control because we're a little busy around here, and here's how you set up a net control, and here's all the elements you'll need. And Scott's a natural leader on his own and took care of it.
When people think of ham radio, they certainly don't think about dynamic thinkers, critical thinkers, people that can think outside the box and be able to adapt and overcome challenges, much like you and Scott did at High River. And I look back on that day in 2013 and wonder what are the lessons that we can learn, because each event and each activation is an opportunity to grow and expand and better prepare for the next disaster that could happen.
Our infrastructure is much more resilient in that area now. Repeaters have been stood up, digipeaters, WinLink gateways. All of this infrastructure is now sitting in High River Hospital on generator backed up and battery backed up power. We're in a much better position today than we were in 2013 to handle, sadly, the next event.
Thank you, Vince, for taking the time to talk to us. I appreciate you highlighting all the roles that amateur radio played in this disaster in High River, Alberta. It really reflects the need for people to understand what hams do and be able to profile the role that we play. And that's one of the reasons why I started this show, was simply to show people that ham radio is more than just playing with walkie-talkies. It is more than just gear and antennas, that we play a role in our community and we play a role as volunteers. And I need to hear from the community at large. I want to hear the stories of ham operators that have been part of disasters, been part of these significant events where communication has failed, and we were the last form of communication. We were the last wire. So if you have a story, please let me know. Please share with me. I'd love to hear it. And Vince, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing the story of High River.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for asking, John. Nice to meet you.